In the early months of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the massive invasion of German-occupied Europe, a small but extraordinary group of men was assembled in the United States, destined to carry out one of the most unusual military operations of the Second World War. Officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this unit would later gain fame under the name the Ghost Army. Unlike conventional divisions equipped with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, the Ghost Army was composed of a mix of artists, engineers, actors, and sound specialists, whose mission was not direct combat, but deception. Their purpose was to mislead German forces, creating the illusion of entire army divisions where none existed, thereby saving lives and altering the course of battles through ingenuity rather than firepower. The conception of this unit began in the minds of American military strategists who realized that conventional tactics alone would not guarantee success in the upcoming European campaigns. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were well entrenched, highly mobile, and adept at predicting standard Allied maneuvers. Planners needed a method to manipulate the enemy's perception without risking massive troop deployments. The solution was to form a division whose entire arsenal consisted of illusions: inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, wooden jeeps, sound projectors, and skilled operators of radio deception. These were not simply props. They were meticulously engineered tools designed to create the appearance of overwhelming force. Recruitment for the Ghost Army was unlike any other in the US military. Standard criteria of physical endurance were complemented by an unusual demand for creativity and artistic skill. Painters, sculptors, designers, and theatrical performers were actively sought. Engineers with a flair for improvisation, capable of adapting to unpredictable combat conditions, were integrated into the unit. Sound specialists trained in audio recording, capable of simulating the din of hundreds of armored vehicles and artillery fire, were essential. Every recruit was expected to contribute a unique skill that would enhance the realism of the deception. By mid-1944, approximately 1,100 men had been selected, each vetted for not only technical proficiency but also psychological resilience, as their work would involve high levels of stress, secrecy, and improvisation under scrutiny. The organizational structure of the Ghost Army reflected its multifaceted mission. The unit was divided into several operational groups, each responsible for a specific aspect of the deception. The Visual Deception section managed inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, and the construction of life-size dummy vehicles that could fool reconnaissance aircraft. A sound engineering section operated large-scale speakers and pre-recorded soundtracks to mimic the movements of armored divisions over several miles. Another section specialized in radio deception, transmitting fake messages that mimicked the communication patterns of actual units. There was also a theatrical team, composed of actors and costume personnel, who added a human dimension to the illusion, moving around the mock positions and conducting rehearsed routines that mirrored real army behavior. Training for the Ghost Army took place in specialized camps across the United States. The soldiers were drilled in the careful deployment of inflatable equipment, practicing the art of creating illusions visible from both ground and air. Sound engineers rehearsed complex audio scenarios, experimenting with speaker placement, timing, and layering of effects to simulate mass troop movements convincingly. Actors practiced mimicking the drills, patrols, and gestures of real soldiers, while visual artists worked on camouflage techniques and the creation of realistic-looking equipment. Every session emphasized synchronization, because the success of the deception relied on the precise coordination of visual, auditory, and radio components. Mistimed sounds or misaligned vehicles could give away the illusion. The culture within the unit was as unusual as its mission. Military discipline coexisted with artistic experimentation. Soldiers and artists collaborated in workshops, often discussing how to adjust shadows on inflatable tanks or refine the sound of distant artillery. Creativity was highly encouraged, yet always in service of operational authenticity. Humor and improvisation played roles in maintaining morale during long drills and monotonous setups, but every joke or adjustment had a tactical purpose. The combination of discipline, innovation, and theatrical flair created a unit whose effectiveness depended as much on mental acuity as on physical endurance. The psychological profile of the soldiers was another critical factor. They were required to understand how an enemy perceives movement, sound, and radio traffic, and to exploit those perceptions systematically. Each man was briefed extensively on German reconnaissance techniques, intelligence procedures, and decision-making processes. The goal was to anticipate enemy reactions to false stimuli and manipulate them into making strategic errors. This required acute observational skills, quick adaptation, and a willingness to immerse fully in the illusion, convincing even themselves of the reality they were projecting. By the time the Ghost Army deployed to Europe, the unit had undergone intensive preparation that combined military strategy, fine art, theatrical performance, and engineering. Inflatable Sherman tanks were constructed to replicate every curve, turret, and cannon with exacting detail. Rubber artillery pieces were painted and shaded to cast realistic shadows under sunlight. Wooden jeeps and supply trucks were designed to withstand wind and minor physical disturbances. Giant speakers, capable of projecting the sounds of armored divisions over distances of 20 miles, were meticulously tested. Radio operators memorized signal patterns, codes, and phrasings of real units to ensure authenticity in intercepted transmissions. The uniqueness of the Ghost Army lay not only in its equipment and creative talents, but in its very purpose. Unlike other units that engaged in direct combat, every action of the Ghost Army was a strategic gambit designed to deceive, misdirect, and psychologically manipulate the enemy. The stakes were high. Errors in timing, placement, or execution could lead to exposure, jeopardizing the lives of thousands of frontline soldiers. Yet for the men who served, this tension was part of the challenge, blending the rigor of warfare with the precision of art. The Ghost Army's first missions would test every aspect of this unconventional training. Their ability to create a credible illusion on European soil would not only determine immediate tactical outcomes but also set a precedent for psychological and strategic warfare. They were tasked with proving that deception, carefully orchestrated, could be as effective as armored divisions, artillery barrages, and airstrikes in shaping the battlefield and achieving victory. As these men crossed the Atlantic, carrying with them inflatable tanks, pre-recorded sound systems, and wooden decoys, they were entering history as one of the most inventive and unusual military units ever assembled. Before deploying to Europe, the Ghost Army underwent an unprecedented training program in the United States, designed to prepare a unit whose entire mission was deception. Unlike traditional infantry or armored divisions, these soldiers needed to master a combination of artistic creativity, engineering skills, and psychological warfare tactics. Training camps were established across several states, including Camp Pine in New Jersey and Fort Dix, where recruits spent weeks learning to synchronize their visual, auditory, and radio-based illusions under controlled yet realistic conditions. The unit, approximately 1,100 men strong, included a remarkable diversity of backgrounds. Roughly 40% of the soldiers were artists, sculptors, or designers, recruited specifically for their ability to manipulate visual perception. Another 30% were engineers or technically trained personnel, capable of assembling inflatable tanks, mock artillery, and wooden vehicles quickly under field conditions. The remaining 30% were actors, sound specialists, and radio operators, all trained to simulate the movements, sounds, and communications of a real army. This composition was carefully calculated. The Ghost Army had to balance creativity and technical expertise with military discipline, ensuring that each operation could be executed flawlessly. Visual deception training was one of the most rigorous components. Soldiers learned to deploy inflatable Sherman tanks, rubber artillery, and wooden jeeps in patterns that would convince enemy reconnaissance planes that a full division was present. Each mock tank was carefully engineered, made from rubberized fabric, reinforced to withstand wind, and painted to mimic light reflections, shadows, and mud accumulation. Soldiers practiced inflating and positioning these units in precise formations within minutes, sometimes in simulated rain or strong wind conditions, to test both durability and realism. A single misplaced tank or incorrectly cast shadow could compromise the entire illusion. Sound deception was equally critical. Specialized teams trained with massive speaker systems capable of projecting the noise of armored divisions across distances of up to 20 miles. Pre-recorded sounds included engines, artillery fire, marching infantry, and even radio chatter. Training involved synchronizing these sounds with the movement of visual decoys, creating the perception of a mobile and active army. In exercises, sound teams would practice adjusting volume, delay, and frequency to account for terrain, weather, and elevation, ensuring that enemy observers would hear a cohesive and convincing soundscape. Actors and theatrical specialists received intensive instruction in military behavior. They learned to move as infantry, conduct patrols, set up mock camps, and interact with their surroundings in ways that would appear authentic from a distance or aerial reconnaissance. Drill routines were rehearsed repeatedly, with instructors emphasizing body language, posture, and the subtle cues that indicate discipline and organization. Actors also practiced improvisation, responding convincingly to unexpected situations, such as a sudden gust of wind collapsing a tent or the accidental tipping of a mock tank, without breaking the illusion. Radio deception training involved simulating communications of entire army divisions. Operators memorized the codes, phrasing, and tempo of real radio traffic. They also practiced improvising transmissions in response to hypothetical enemy intercepts. During exercises, German-speaking consultants would act as enemy intelligence, intercepting transmissions and assessing their credibility. This feedback was invaluable. It allowed the Ghost Army to fine-tune its communications, ensuring that even the most experienced German radio analysts would be convinced that the units were real. The psychological component of training was particularly demanding. Soldiers had to fully commit to their roles, often working long hours under high stress, and maintain concentration despite adverse weather or the monotony of repetitive drills. Leadership emphasized that the success of the unit depended on immersion in the illusion. Every detail, from the exact angle of a decoy tank to the timing of a distant artillery sound, could influence enemy decisions and potentially save thousands of lives. Recruits were also trained to anticipate enemy reactions, learning how to exploit common assumptions and biases in reconnaissance and intelligence analysis. Interdisciplinary collaboration was a hallmark of the training. Visual artists worked alongside engineers to design decoys that could be rapidly deployed in the field. Sound specialists coordinated with actors to simulate troop movements convincingly. Every exercise emphasized timing, coordination, and precision, as even small errors could reveal the deception. The training regimen included full-scale mock operations, where multiple teams simultaneously deployed decoys, activated sound systems, and transmitted radio traffic, simulating real battlefield conditions. These exercises were often observed by high-ranking officers, including General George Patton's staff, who recognized the strategic potential of such operations. Attention to detail extended to seemingly minor elements, such as smoke, dust, and terrain adaptation. Soldiers learned to produce artificial smoke from small generators to simulate campfires or vehicle activity. Dust patterns were studied and recreated to mimic the movement of heavy armored vehicles. Even the placement of tarps, camouflage netting, and tents was carefully choreographed to create the appearance of fully operational encampments. These subtleties were critical. Enemy reconnaissance pilots were trained to notice even slight inconsistencies, so absolute attention to detail was mandatory. By the end of the training period, the Ghost Army had achieved a level of preparation unmatched in any conventional military unit. Recruits were capable of transforming empty fields into convincing battlefronts, complete with moving armored divisions, active artillery, human patrols, and realistic communications. Each soldier understood the stakes. A single error could compromise the illusion and place thousands of combat troops at risk. The combination of art, science, psychology, and military precision produced a unit uniquely equipped to change the battlefield without firing a single shot. The effectiveness of the training became evident even before deployment. In one large-scale exercise, the Ghost Army simulated a 30,000-strong division using just a fraction of their personnel and decoys. German-speaking observers brought in to evaluate the exercise reported it as completely convincing, noting that they would have committed reinforcements based on the perceived threat. This success confirmed that the elaborate preparation, meticulous attention to detail, and integration of diverse skills could indeed manipulate enemy perceptions on a massive scale. By the time the Ghost Army shipped to Europe in 1944, they were not merely soldiers. They were artists, engineers, and psychologists, trained to reshape reality on the battlefield. Their preparations in the United States ensured that when they arrived in France, Belgium, or Luxembourg, they could immediately begin creating illusions so convincing that even the most experienced German commanders would be deceived. The training camps, exercises, and psychological conditioning were the foundation for a series of operations that would leave a lasting mark on military history, demonstrating the power of deception as a force multiplier in modern warfare. Upon arriving in Europe in the spring of 1944, the Ghost Army faced its first real test, to implement the skills honed in American training camps under actual combat conditions. The unit was deployed to France, where Allied forces were preparing for the D-Day landings, but German troops remained vigilant, with reconnaissance flights and patrols monitoring every suspicious movement. The mission of the Ghost Army was clear: create the illusion of large American forces in areas where none existed, diverting enemy attention from actual troop concentrations and operations. Their first operations were both experimental and highly consequential, as the success or failure of their deception could directly influence the outcome of the upcoming Normandy invasion. The initial deployment included around 1,000 personnel, supplemented by a fleet of inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, wooden jeeps, and pre-recorded sound equipment. Visual deception teams began by establishing mock divisions in strategically selected locations across northern France, using terrain to their advantage. Open fields were ideal for aerial reconnaissance deception, while wooded areas and rolling hills provided natural concealment for staging and maneuvering decoys. Inflatable Sherman tanks, each approximately 20 feet long and 8 feet high, were positioned in formations that mimicked real battalion arrangements, with smaller rubber artillery pieces interspersed to create the appearance of artillery support. Engineers and artists worked side by side to ensure that shadows, proportions, and even weathering on the decoys looked authentic from both ground level and aerial perspectives. The sound deception teams were equally busy. Massive speaker arrays, capable of projecting the sounds of armored divisions over distances of up to 20 miles, were deployed along key observation points. Pre-recorded sounds included engine noises, artillery fire, marching infantry, and vehicle movements, carefully timed and layered to simulate coordinated troop activities. In practice drills, German reconnaissance planes were observed responding to these soundscapes, often altering flight paths or reporting exaggerated troop strength. Soldiers and operators learned to adjust pitch, timing, and volume to account for wind, terrain, and vegetation, constantly refining the realism of the auditory illusion. Radio deception was another critical component. Operators transmitted fake orders, reports, and routine communications from fictional divisions, complete with authentic code patterns and military jargon. German intelligence, intercepting these transmissions, consistently overestimated the number and location of American units. In one notable early operation, intercepted radio traffic suggested the presence of a full armored division near the town of Avranches. In reality, only a handful of sound operators and visual decoys were stationed there. Nevertheless, German commanders redeployed substantial forces to counter this phantom threat, weakening defenses in nearby sectors where real Allied attacks were planned. The effectiveness of these first operations was immediately apparent. On several occasions, German reconnaissance pilots reported entire divisions where none existed. In one instance, a squadron photographing the Ghost Army's positions captured images of what appeared to be 30 tanks and 15 artillery pieces, when in fact only 5 inflatables and 3 rubber guns were present. Field officers, relying on these photographs, made tactical decisions based on non-existent enemy strength. The Ghost Army's ability to manipulate enemy perceptions through a combination of visual, auditory, and radio deception demonstrated the unprecedented strategic value of psychological operations. Coordination between teams was essential for maintaining the illusion. Visual, sound, and radio units operated on synchronized schedules to mimic the activity of a fully deployed division. Soldiers moved among the decoys, actors performed drills, and sound teams triggered pre-recorded engine and artillery noises to simulate preparation for an offensive. In several instances, exercises included staged artillery firing, achieved through sound effects and carefully timed small detonations, giving the impression of active combat without endangering personnel. The seamless integration of these elements required constant communication, rehearsals, and meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that the deception remained convincing under scrutiny. One of the most dramatic early successes occurred in the Ardennes region. The Ghost Army deployed a series of inflatable tanks and rubber artillery pieces along open plains, with actors simulating supply operations and reconnaissance patrols. At the same time, massive speakers projected the sounds of advancing divisions, and radio operators broadcasted fake operational orders. German commanders, observing from both the ground and the air, reported the presence of a heavily reinforced corps. This misperception caused the enemy to divert troops and resources, ultimately creating a tactical advantage for real Allied forces moving elsewhere. Weather and environmental conditions added complexity to the operations. Soldiers often worked under heavy rain, wind, or mud, which threatened to collapse or displace the inflatable equipment. Engineers and artists had to improvise rapidly, securing decoys, adjusting shadows, and maintaining the alignment of formations. Actors, meanwhile, continued their performances in adverse conditions, maintaining the illusion of activity. The combination of technical skill, improvisation, and psychological insight ensured that the Ghost Army could maintain operational credibility despite environmental challenges. The first operations also provided critical intelligence on enemy behavior. Analysts monitored German responses to the deceptions, noting patterns in troop movements, communications, and reconnaissance reporting. These insights allowed the Ghost Army to refine its techniques, identifying which visual arrangements, sound effects, and radio transmissions were most effective at generating misperceptions. Early operations thus served not only to mislead the enemy but also to evolve the art and science of battlefield deception. By the end of these initial missions, the Ghost Army had established a reputation among Allied commanders as a highly effective tool for strategic manipulation. German forces were consistently outmaneuvered by illusions, diverting attention and resources to non-existent threats. The combination of visual decoys, sound projection, and radio deception had proven that a small, highly specialized unit could exert disproportionate influence on the battlefield, achieving objectives that would have otherwise required far greater manpower and firepower. These early operations laid the groundwork for the larger, more ambitious missions that would follow during the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaigns, demonstrating that ingenuity, discipline, and psychological acumen could achieve results equal to, or even surpassing, traditional combat operations. In the weeks leading up to the D-Day landings in June 1944, the Ghost Army faced its most critical mission yet, Operation Fortitude North and South, designed to convince German commanders that the Allies would land in locations other than Normandy. The stakes were enormous. Any misstep could lead to a concentrated German defense at the actual invasion site, potentially costing thousands of Allied lives. The Ghost Army's task was to simulate entire divisions, both visually and audibly, while simultaneously transmitting convincing radio communications to mislead enemy intelligence. This operation would test every skill the unit had honed during its months of preparation. For Operation Fortitude, the Ghost Army deployed approximately 1,100 men, supported by a fleet of over 400 inflatable Sherman tanks, 200 rubber artillery pieces, and nearly 100 wooden trucks and jeeps. The visual deception teams arranged these mock vehicles in realistic battalion formations across multiple sectors of northern France, including areas near Pas-de-Calais, a location chosen to exaggerate the threat of an invasion far from Normandy. Inflatable tanks were crafted with precise attention to detail, including painted insignias, turret shadows, and even mud splatters to simulate activity. Engineers worked tirelessly to anchor them securely, as wind and rain could easily disrupt the formations and compromise the illusion. Sound deception played a crucial role in amplifying the visual effect. Massive speaker arrays, strategically placed along key observation points, broadcast the sounds of moving armored divisions, artillery fire, and marching infantry. Pre-recorded tracks were layered to create depth and realism, simulating hundreds of vehicles moving simultaneously. In practice runs, These soundscapes were effective enough that German reconnaissance pilots reported massive troop movements and concentrated divisions, often overestimating the actual number of forces by a factor of 10. Coordination was essential. Sound teams synchronized their audio with the movements of inflatable vehicles and actors, producing a seamless illusion of a fully mobilized army. Radio deception added a third layer of credibility. Skilled operators transmitted fictitious messages between divisions, using authentic call signs, codes, and phrasing consistent with real Allied units. These transmissions were intentionally designed to be intercepted by German intelligence, reinforcing the illusion that massive forces were assembling outside of Normandy. Analysts later confirmed that German command intercepted thousands of these communications, many of which were taken at face value, prompting troop redeployments and adjustments that directly benefited the actual invasion forces. The theatrical component was equally critical. Actors, dressed in standard US Army uniforms, simulated the behavior of entire divisions, conducting mock drills, patrols, and vehicle maintenance routines. They moved among the inflatable tanks and artillery, coordinated with sound teams, and even staged supply operations, creating the impression of logistical activity. Observed from the air or a distance, these routines appeared indistinguishable from those of real troops, further convincing German reconnaissance of a large-scale build-up. One dramatic instance occurred near Boulogne-sur-Mer, where a unit of 50 actors, 20 inflatable tanks, and multiple rubber artillery pieces created the illusion of a full armored brigade. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the area over several days, reporting the presence of approximately 2,500 troops and 30 tanks. In reality, only a fraction of these numbers existed, yet the reports were taken seriously by German command. The diversion of German resources to counter this phantom brigade delayed reinforcements from reaching Normandy, directly aiding the success of the D-Day landings. Environmental challenges added tension and complexity. Heavy rains, gusting winds, and muddy terrain often threatened to collapse inflatable vehicles or make mock artillery appear unrealistic. Engineers and artists had to improvise on the spot, adjusting placements, reinforcing anchors, and repairing any damage caused by weather. Actors continued their performances despite these harsh conditions, maintaining the illusion with unwavering commitment. Every hour of sustained realism increased the credibility of the deception and kept German forces guessing. The effectiveness of Operation Fortitude extended beyond visual and auditory deception. German commanders, already anxious about potential invasion points, were misled by a combination of conflicting intelligence, photographs, and radio intercepts. Reports consistently exaggerated the size and location of Allied forces. By the time D-Day commenced on June 6, 1944, German High Command was convinced that Normandy was a diversion, with the main assault expected at Pas-de-Calais or Norway. This misperception led to a delayed and diluted German response to the actual landings, reducing resistance on the beaches and contributing to the success of the invasion. The operation also demonstrated the Ghost Army's unique ability to combine art and science in warfare. Inflatable vehicles were designed with attention to shadows and perspective. Soundscapes were engineered to simulate hundreds of troops, and radio transmissions mimicked real military communications down to minute details. The integration of these elements created a multisensory illusion that fooled even experienced intelligence officers and reconnaissance pilots. Following D-Day, analysis of the operation revealed its strategic significance. German forces had redeployed at least 2 full corps away from Normandy, a decision influenced directly by the illusions created by the Ghost Army. Reports from Allied intelligence indicated that thousands of soldiers were kept away from the actual front lines due to the perceived threat, demonstrating the unit's disproportionate impact relative to its size. The success of Operation Fortitude validated the concept of large-scale battlefield deception, setting a precedent for psychological and strategic operations in future conflicts. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ghost Army was its innovative use of technology and artistry to create convincing battlefield illusions. Central to their operations were the carefully crafted visual decoys, which included inflatable tanks, rubber artillery pieces, wooden trucks, and even mock airplanes. These devices were designed to appear authentic not only from the ground but also from aerial reconnaissance, a critical consideration given the Luftwaffe's extensive surveillance capabilities in occupied Europe. Each element of the deception was engineered with precision, balancing realism, portability, and durability under field conditions. Inflatable Sherman tanks were the cornerstone of visual deception. Measuring approximately 20 feet in length and 8 feet in height, they replicated every detail of a real tank, from turret shapes to hatches, and even the textures of armored plating. Made from rubberized fabric, the tanks could be inflated in under 20 minutes by a small team of engineers, allowing rapid deployment and repositioning. Special attention was paid to shadows, as aerial photography was highly sensitive to light and perspective. Some tanks were equipped with internal frameworks to maintain shape under windy conditions, while others included weighted bases to prevent tipping. Paint techniques simulated mud, wear, and sun exposure, ensuring the decoys would pass visual scrutiny. Rubber artillery pieces complemented the tanks, simulating field guns and anti-tank emplacements. Each piece was carefully scaled and detailed, with barrel shadows and realistic silhouette profiles. Soldiers were trained to position them in proper firing formations, often interspersed with inflatable tanks and wooden supply vehicles to create a sense of a fully operational battalion. In some exercises, small pyrotechnic charges were used to simulate firing effects, producing smoke and flash, which further enhanced the illusion of active artillery operations. Wooden trucks and jeeps were integral to simulating logistical activity. These lightweight vehicles could be quickly moved to suggest convoys, supply movements, or troop rotations. Painted and weathered to mimic operational wear, they were positioned alongside tanks and artillery to create dynamic scenes of military life. Even the smallest details were considered. Tarps, fuel cans, and camouflage netting were carefully arranged to replicate genuine supply operations, convincing observers that a real, fully equipped division was present. The unit also experimented with mock aircraft, including wooden and inflatable reconnaissance planes. Positioned on fields or at temporary airstrips, these decoys created the impression of air support and operational readiness. Although the planes were static, their strategic placement and the addition of painted markings gave them authenticity from the air, especially when viewed at a distance or under imperfect lighting conditions. These aerial decoys reinforced the overall illusion, suggesting a combined arms capability beyond the actual strength of the Ghost Army. Sound technology was another defining feature of the deception. Massive speaker arrays, sometimes weighing over 300 pounds, were deployed along observation points and ridgelines. Pre-recorded tracks included engine noises, artillery fire, marching infantry, and the ambient sounds of military operations. These audio simulations were carefully timed with the movement of visual decoys, producing a convincing sense of mass mobilization. Operators experimented with pitch, layering, and volume to ensure sounds projected realistically over long distances. In some cases, sounds were transmitted over distances of up to 20 miles, effectively manipulating enemy perceptions and prompting responses based on entirely fabricated activity. Radio deception was equally sophisticated. Operators transmitted messages mimicking real unit communications, complete with authentic call signs, code words, and military jargon. Transmissions were intentionally structured to be intercepted by German intelligence, creating a believable operational network. Analysts later confirmed that these communications had a measurable impact. German commanders allocated resources and repositioned troops based on signals that originated entirely from the Ghost Army's fabricated units. The integration of visual, auditory, and radio elements ensured that the illusions were multisensory and therefore more convincing. The deployment of these technologies required extensive coordination and training. Engineers and artists worked together to ensure that inflatables and wooden vehicles were positioned correctly, considering terrain, elevation, and lighting. Sound teams synchronized audio cues with the movement of decoys, while radio operators coordinated transmission schedules to maintain operational consistency. Rehearsals often involved full-scale exercises simulating battalion maneuvers, complete with actors performing infantry drills to add a human dimension to the deception. Field reports indicated the effectiveness of these methods. In one exercise, a small team using fewer than 50 inflatable tanks, 20 artillery pieces, and 10 wooden trucks created the illusion of a 2,500-strong armored brigade. German reconnaissance photographs and intercepted radio messages confirmed the perceived presence of a large division, illustrating the disproportionate impact of carefully engineered deception. This combination of artistry, engineering, and psychological insight allowed the Ghost Army to influence enemy decisions without engaging in direct combat. Environmental adaptations were also crucial. Inflatable tanks were reinforced to withstand wind gusts of up to 40 miles per hour, while sound teams adjusted playback to account for rain, fog, and varying terrain. Wooden vehicles were treated with weatherproof coatings, and camouflage netting was applied to blend with surrounding foliage. Soldiers continuously monitored and adjusted the equipment to maintain the illusion, demonstrating the high level of technical skill required to execute such operations successfully. In summary, the Ghost Army's technological and artistic innovations were central to its unprecedented effectiveness. Inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, wooden vehicles, mock aircraft, sound projection systems, and radio transmissions were integrated to create fully convincing battlefield illusions. Each element was meticulously designed, deployed, and synchronized to mislead German forces, divert resources, and protect Allied troops. The unit's work demonstrated that deception could be weaponized as effectively as tanks, guns, or aircraft, setting a new standard for psychological operations and battlefield strategy. The radio war was the Ghost Army's invisible blade, the component of deception that spoke directly into the enemy's ears and into the mind of its intelligence apparatus. Where inflatable tanks could be seen and sound arrays heard, radio deception could be intercepted, catalogued, and trusted by opposing analysts. The Ghost Army's radio operators were trained to do more than chatter. They were taught to manufacture credibility. They produced patterns of traffic, signature phrasing, and timing that matched the behavior of real combat units, and they did so deliberately to exploit the routine ways German signal intelligence evaluated threats. From the unit's earliest exercises, instructors emphasized that authenticity in radio traffic was not achieved by volume alone but by texture. Operators learned to mimic the cadence of field reports, the clipped syntax of urgent requests, and the small, human irregularities, background noise, static, and occasional hesitations that made a transmission seem genuine. They studied transcripts and listened to recordings of actual frontline communications to internalize expected call signs, authentication procedures, and response times. Then they layered these elements into a program of false transmissions designed to be intercepted by German monitoring stations. Over months of operations, the Ghost Army generated thousands of such transmissions. In major deception campaigns prior to and during D-Day, intercepts of fabricated traffic numbered in the many hundreds per week, enough to create a persistent signal in German intelligence reporting. Technical craft underpinned the performance. Radio teams used real military radio sets operating on standard frequencies and adhered to correct procedures. Prearranged call signs, scheduled check-ins, repeated challenge and response authentication methods, and even intentional brevity when appropriate. They alternated between routine administrative traffic, fuel requests, supply estimates, weather reports, and movement-oriented messages that suggested imminent maneuvers. Crucially, they simulated the communications network of a full brigade or division. Headquarters chatter, artillery forward observer calls, logistics updates, and occasional terse combat reports. This multi-layered traffic produced a convincing signature. The pattern resembled not a single transmitter but an entire organizational topology. Psychology amplified the technical work. German intelligence analysts operated under time pressure and cognitive bias like any human analysts. If aerial photos suggested activity in a sector and radio intercepts simultaneously indicated the presence of units, the two sources would mutually reinforce one another. The Ghost Army's approach exploited this confirmation loop. Radio deception was most effective when synchronized with visual decoys and soundscapes. A German reconnaissance photo of tanks, a distant rumble of engines, and intercepted radio chatter about resupply formed a bundle of evidence that was difficult to dismiss. Enemy command began to treat such multimodal signals as corroborated intelligence, increasing the likelihood of tactical redeployment in response. Operational examples illuminate the method. In several pre-invasion operations, Ghost Army radio teams broadcast fictitious orders that referenced well-known Allied unit names or used call signs consistent with adjacent real formations. When German intercepts recorded requests for fuel and ammunition timed to coincide with night marches broadcast by sound units, field commanders interpreted the pattern as the signature of an impending movement. On multiple occasions, German staff notes later reflected decisions to withhold reserves or to reposition divisions to face the perceived threat in sectors where, in truth, only decoys and radio voices existed. The unit also manipulated limitations in German SIGINT. Much of German signals analysis relied on traffic frequency, volume, and the presence of certain coded markers to classify a force as active. Ghost Army operators deliberately crafted traffic to exceed those thresholds. A few strategically placed transmissions, timed during key reconnaissance windows, could create the statistical impression of ongoing operations. In the run-up to D-Day, analysts concluded, based on the cumulative signal profile, that significant formations were staged at Pas-de-Calais, and that conclusion helped delay the movement of mobile reserves southward to Normandy. Deception by omission was another tactic. Sometimes the Ghost Army transmitted plausible but deliberately vague messages, supply shortages, maintenance requests, or weather complaints. Such benign chatter had two effects. First, it suggested normalcy and operational cadence, the frequent mundane exchanges typical of a functioning unit. Second, it consumed German analytical attention, forcing analysts to catalogue and integrate the invented unit's administrative footprint alongside more threatening signals. The enemy's cognitive load increased. When the real assault came elsewhere, decision-makers were slower to reconcile conflicting inputs. Countermeasures and risks were recognized. Experienced German radio units occasionally noted anomalies, perfect timing, repeated phrasing, or lack of personal touches in transmissions. To mitigate suspicion, Ghost Army radio operators introduced controlled errors, bad connections, cutouts, or minor miscodings to simulate human fallibility. They also adopted regional linguistic traits where necessary and adjusted transmission patterns to reflect the expected tempo during daytime operations versus night movements. These small imperfections paradoxically made the overall network appear more authentic. Intelligence analysis after the war indicated tangible payoff. German High Command diverted significant reserves based, in part, on intercepted communications that the Ghost Army manufactured. At least 2 co-level redeployments are commonly attributed to the combined radio-visual sound deceptions around D-Day, and thousands of German troops were consequently held away from the actual invasion beaches. The cumulative effect was strategic. The Allies achieved localized superiority at critical moments, in part because enemy commanders were acting on a constructed reality rather than the true disposition of forces. Beyond the immediate tactical wins, the Ghost Army's radio work left a methodological legacy. It proved that signal environments could be engineered to produce predictable cognitive responses in an adversary. The unit's practice foreshadowed later developments in electronic warfare and information operations, where the control of information flows and the manipulation of perceived truth are central. For the operators themselves, the job was exhausting and moral in a unique way, to lie so convincingly that it reshaped lives on the battlefield. Yet most veterans reflected on their role as life-saving, a deception that substituted illusion for bloodshed. In the end, radio deception was not a stunt but an instrument of warcraft. It required technical skill, theatrical timing, and a deep understanding of the psychological wiring of intelligence organizations. Combined with inflatable tanks and booming speaker arrays, the Ghost Army's radio operations turned empty fields into strategic anchors of Allied planning, demonstrating that in modern war, what an enemy believes can be as consequential as what an enemy can physically see or shoot. Life in the Ghost Army was as much about human ingenuity as it was about deception. Behind the inflatable tanks, booming speakers, and meticulously crafted radio transmissions were individuals whose creativity, courage, and dedication made the entire operation possible. The soldiers came from diverse backgrounds. Some were painters fresh from New York art schools, others were theatrical performers from Broadway, and still others were engineers accustomed to designing machines in peacetime factories. Each brought a unique set of skills, and together they created a force capable of bending reality itself on the battlefield. Take, for instance, the story of Bill Blass, a young painter who had studied at Parsons School of Design before the war. Blass was recruited specifically for his ability to replicate textures, shadows, and realistic wear on equipment. In the field, he would spend hours meticulously painting inflatable tanks to mimic mud splatters, sun-faded armor, and battle scars. Every brushstroke mattered. A misaligned shadow or uneven tone could reveal the decoy as artificial to enemy reconnaissance. Blass later recounted that he often worked late into the night, using oil lamps and flashlights, carefully scrutinizing every angle from which the decoys might be observed. For him, the war became a canvas, and the survival of Allied troops depended on his attention to detail. Actors also played a critical role in maintaining the illusion. Men like Arthur Shilstone, a former stage performer, were trained to simulate the behavior of infantry, artillery crews, and supply units. They rehearsed marching formations, the loading of artillery, and even the gestures of commanding officers. Shilstone once recounted an incident during a night operation in northern France when a sudden gust of wind toppled several inflatable tanks. Without hesitation, he and his fellow actors improvised a drill, moving in formation around the fallen decoys and continuing the illusion of troop activity. German reconnaissance planes flying overhead reported seeing fully operational units, unaware that the soldiers they observed were performers responding to an environmental mishap. Engineers, meanwhile, faced their own set of challenges. Men like Harry L. Brown were responsible for ensuring that the inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, and wooden trucks could withstand the unpredictable conditions of the European theatre. Brown and his team devised anchoring systems to prevent inflatables from toppling in gusty winds and developed quick repair techniques for tears or punctures. They also experimented with materials to achieve the correct visual weight and reflectivity so that decoys would appear convincing from both aerial photographs and ground observation. Brown recalled that during one operation in the Ardennes, heavy rainfall threatened to collapse several tanks just before a German reconnaissance flight. His team worked frantically in the mud to secure the inflatables, and the operation proceeded without the enemy ever noticing a flaw. Sound specialists had their own high-pressure tasks. They operated massive speaker arrays capable of projecting the sounds of armored divisions over 20 miles. Men like James K. Leonard, trained in audio engineering, carefully mixed layers of pre-recorded engine noise, marching infantry, and artillery fire to create realistic battlefield acoustics. Leonard described the tension of timing these sounds precisely with the movement of decoys and actors. Even a slight misalignment could disrupt the illusion. On several occasions, he and his team had to recalibrate the speakers mid-operation to adjust for wind direction, distance, and terrain, all while under the threat of detection. The human element extended beyond technical expertise. Soldiers shared a camaraderie rooted in mutual dependence and the unusual nature of their mission. They lived and trained together in constant secrecy, aware that their success relied on everyone performing flawlessly. Letters and diaries reveal a mix of anxiety, exhilaration, and pride. One soldier wrote about the surreal experience of marching around empty fields with rubber tanks, knowing that unseen eyes from the sky were being deceived, and that their work might spare lives on the front lines. Another described the intense focus required to maintain an illusion under harsh weather, fatigue, and constant observation. Several veterans recounted moments of humor amidst the tension. During an exercise near northern France, a gust of wind lifted a decoy tank, sending it rolling across the field. Instead of panic, soldiers improvised, incorporating the wandering tank into the illusion, and the German observers recorded it as part of the operational activity. These anecdotes highlight not only creativity but also the psychological resilience needed to perform under stress, often in situations where failure could have serious consequences. Despite the theatrical and artistic aspects, the soldiers were fully aware of the stakes. Their work directly impacted the survival of real combat troops and the success of major operations such as D-Day. The knowledge that their improvisation, painting, or audio engineering could save lives added both weight and urgency to every task. Veterans often described a unique combination of fear and exhilaration: fear of exposure or error, exhilaration from the artistry and cleverness of the work, and pride in contributing to victories without firing a single shot. The diverse skill sets in the Ghost Army created a culture where innovation was prized but always in service of tactical objectives. Collaboration between painters, engineers, actors, and sound specialists was constant. For instance, an engineer might suggest adjusting a tank's position to improve shadow accuracy, which a painter would then enhance visually, while actors coordinated movement to match projected artillery sounds. This synergy ensured that every illusion, no matter how small, contributed to a convincing whole. In addition to day-to-day operational work, soldiers often improvised new techniques in the field. They experimented with camouflage patterns, lighting effects, and synchronized sound sequences. Some created decoy convoys that moved using pulley systems or timed inflation sequences, adding a dynamic quality to the deception. These innovations reflect a combination of military strategy, artistry, and practical engineering that was unique to the Ghost Army. In the end, the personal stories of the Ghost Army's members underscore the human ingenuity and psychological courage behind their operations. Artists like Blass, actors like Shilstone, engineers like Brown, and sound specialists like Leonard were not only soldiers but creators of illusion on an unprecedented scale. Their combined efforts transformed empty fields into convincing theaters of war, manipulated enemy perceptions, and ultimately saved countless lives. The Ghost Army's legacy is a testament to the extraordinary impact that individual talent, when applied collectively and creatively, can have on the course of history. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends far beyond its immediate impact during World War II, influencing modern military strategy, psychological operations, and even civilian fields such as theater, design, and sound engineering. While the unit's operations were initially classified, once declassified, their methods offered a blueprint for the integration of art, technology, and psychology in warfare. The lessons learned from the Ghost Army continue to inform military planning, demonstrating the power of perception, deception, and interdisciplinary collaboration on the battlefield. One of the most direct influences is in the field of modern psychological operations, PSYOPs. The Ghost Army demonstrated that manipulating an enemy's perception could achieve effects equivalent to deploying actual combat units. Inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, and soundscapes created the illusion of divisions numbering tens of thousands, compelling German commanders to divert resources away from critical sectors. This principle is now a cornerstone of psychological operations, creating uncertainty and influencing decision-making without necessarily engaging in physical combat. Contemporary military planners incorporate similar tactics using advanced technology, such as electronic warfare, drones, cyber deception, and virtual simulations, all of which trace conceptual roots back to the techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army. The use of multisensory deception, combining visual, auditory, and electronic signals, also established a template for modern military operations. For example, during the Gulf War, coalition forces used electronic decoys and radio transmissions to mislead Iraqi forces about troop movements and target locations. Similarly, during the 2003 Iraq invasion, decoy vehicles and false radio traffic were employed to simulate the presence of armored units in locations where no combat forces existed, forcing adversaries to commit resources unnecessarily. These strategies echo the Ghost Army's original approach: small, specialized units generating outsized effects through controlled illusions. Beyond battlefield applications, the Ghost Army highlighted the value of interdisciplinary collaboration in high-stakes problem-solving. Artists, engineers, actors, and sound specialists work together seamlessly, leveraging their unique skills to create convincing illusions. This model has influenced modern military training and organizational approaches, emphasizing creativity, flexibility, and the integration of non-traditional expertise. The concept that an effective soldier can also be an artist or engineer has shifted perceptions about the skill sets necessary for success in complex, technologically advanced operations. Leadership studies now often cite the Ghost Army as an example of innovative teamwork and adaptive strategy under pressure. The psychological impact of the Ghost Army on enemy forces offers another enduring lesson. By creating uncertainty and exploiting cognitive biases, the unit forced German commanders to make decisions based on misperceived threats. Analysts later observed that even highly experienced officers were misled by well-timed visual and auditory deceptions, demonstrating that perception can be more decisive than reality in wartime decision-making. This insight continues to influence military doctrine, highlighting the strategic value of information management, camouflage, and deception as force multipliers. Modern military simulations routinely test the impact of false intelligence on enemy decision-making, reflecting lessons first operationalized by the Ghost Army. Furthermore, the unit's legacy underscores the ethical and practical dimensions of non-lethal deception. The Ghost Army achieved strategic objectives, diverted enemy forces, and saved thousands of lives without firing a single shot. This non-lethal approach illustrates that the art of war is not solely about destruction but also about ingenuity, misdirection, and efficiency. In modern contexts, such principles inform strategies that minimize collateral damage and leverage technology to achieve objectives while reducing risk to both combatants and civilians. Psychological operations, cyber deception, and electronic warfare increasingly rely on these same non-lethal concepts. The preservation of the Ghost Army's history has also contributed to public understanding of military innovation. Exhibits, documentaries, and academic studies have documented the operations in detail, highlighting both technical ingenuity and human creativity. Veterans' personal accounts emphasize not only the operational successes but also the extraordinary adaptability and courage required to perform high-stakes deception under adverse conditions. Educational programs now reference the Ghost Army as a case study in creative problem-solving, illustrating how unconventional thinking can have strategic consequences on a global scale. In terms of technological legacy, the Ghost Army pioneered techniques that informed subsequent developments in military simulation, camouflage, and electronic deception. Inflatable decoys inspired later designs for radar-reflective targets, decoy artillery, and unmanned reconnaissance units. Sound projection systems evolved into modern acoustic warfare technologies used for signaling, distraction, and psychological effect. Even radio deception anticipated principles of modern electronic countermeasures, including signal spoofing, traffic manipulation, and controlled misinformation campaigns. The Ghost Army also demonstrated the enduring importance of adaptability. Soldiers often faced unpredictable conditions, such as wind, rain, and enemy observation, requiring rapid problem-solving and improvisation. Modern military training emphasizes similar adaptability, teaching units to respond to unexpected threats and environmental factors while maintaining operational objectives. The Ghost Army's example illustrates that creativity, rapid decision-making, and interdisciplinary collaboration can provide a decisive edge in complex, uncertain environments. Finally, the legacy of the Ghost Army lies in its demonstration that perception can be weaponized as effectively as firepower. By combining art, technology, psychology, and military discipline, the unit created a new paradigm for warfare. They proved that a relatively small, specialized force could achieve disproportionate strategic outcomes by manipulating enemy perception, saving lives, and shaping the battlefield without direct combat. Today, the Ghost Army serves as both a historical marvel and a practical model for future operations, highlighting that the most powerful weapon may sometimes be the illusion of strength rather than its actual presence.